I wasn't in a good place that fall, and I knew it, even while I kept calling it a practical move like I was filling out paperwork instead of admitting I had run out of road in town. I was 44, worked diesel my whole adult life, and I had reached that kind of burnout where every engine knock sounded personal and every customer question felt like a test. I was already failing. My mother had been gone 14 months by then, and her place up on Miller Ridge had been sitting empty except for wind, mice, and whatever memories decide to stay in a house after the person leaves it. I told people I was moving up there to save money, clear my head, maybe fix the roof before winter. All true. Not the whole truth. The whole truth was my son, Eli, had stopped calling me first. He was 16 and lived with his mom in town, and we had slid into this careful, polite distance that felt worse than a fight. Fights at least mean somebody still expects something. What we had was calendar talk, pickup times, school schedule. How's baseball? Fine. Need anything? No. By the time I loaded my toolbox into the bed of my truck and drove up the mountain for good, we hadn't had a real conversation in so long, I caught myself rehearsing simple sentences before I dialed him, then not dialing because they sounded wrong. I carried that up with me, same as the duffel bag and coffee maker. My mother's homestead sat above a narrow county road where pavement gave up and washouts took over. The cabin itself was decent once you reached it, cedar siding silvered by weather, metal roof, a porch rail she painted every other spring whether it needed it or not. The problem was the last half mile. After late summer rain, the old access track had slumped and peeled down the slope in 2 places, too unstable for a pickup. The only way in was a steep footpath the locals called Widow's Climb, and I understood the name by my second trip. Red clay slick as soap where water crossed it, loose shale where the hill pinched, roots polished hard by boots over generations. That path didn't care how strong you were. It took balance, patience, and humility, and I had shown up with only one of those. I started a routine because routine was the only thing I trusted. Up before first light, coffee black, and hot enough to punish me for sleeping late. Down Widow's Climb with Juniper at my heel, old blue heeler with one white ear and a way of glancing back like she was checking whether I still planned to act stubborn. Load groceries at the truck, 2 sacks if I felt sensible, 3 if I felt prideful, then up the hill 1 careful step at a time while my thighs burned and my breath got loud in my own ears. Breakfast was usually whatever didn't need a pan. Lunch was whatever didn't need thought. Supper I ate standing at the sink most nights, looking out at fir trunks and the line where fog settled in the drainage, pretending I preferred quiet over company. By the 3rd week of October, I could tell exactly where the path would betray me by the colour of the clay. Dark rust meant slick. Pale meant crumbly. Leaf cover meant hidden rut. I still slipped. Not dramatic falls, mostly the kind that made your groceries jerk and your temper flare. But once I went down to one knee hard enough to bruise through denim and tore the handle off a bag with potatoes and onions in it. Potatoes rolled into mud like they'd been waiting all morning for a chance. I stood there breathing hard and said, out loud, "Sorry, fellas," as I gathered them up one by one. Then I looked around at empty trees and started laughing at myself because there wasn't anybody else around to hear me lose my mind. Juniper watched with that calm dog face that says she has seen worse from you and will keep your secrets. Inside the house, every room still carried my mother's habits in ways too ordinary to prepare for. Rubber bands looped around the breadbox knob, a notepad by the phone with grocery math in her blocky handwriting. A jar of screws on the windowsill over the sink, separated by size because she said searching for the right one was how projects got abandoned. I'd open a drawer for a can opener and find her old church bulletins folded under dish towels, dates and hymn numbers, from years when I still came up for Sunday dinner. The place did not accuse me. That was the hard part. It just remembered me at better angles. I kept busy to avoid thinking in straight lines, replaced a cracked section of stovepipe, patched a leak where the mudroom roof met the main wall, pulled blackberry vines off the lower fence even though there were no animals to keep in. Practical work made a day look complete from the outside, and I leaned on that. But evenings stretched. I'd sit on the porch step with Juniper's head against my boot and listen to the mountains settle down. Jays fussing, then silence, then the creek at the bottom crossing, always moving whether anybody watched it or not. That was when my mind turned toward town, toward my son, toward all the moments I should have handled better and didn't. One Wednesday, I called him just after 7 when I knew practice would be over. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, buddy, you home?" "Yeah, just got in." "How was school?" "Fine." I heard cabinet doors in the background, his mom probably starting dinner, normal house sounds that used to be mine too. I gripped the porch rail hard enough my knuckles ached. "I'm getting settled up here," I said. "Roof's holding, stove works, path still trying to kill me." A small laugh came through, quick and surprised. "Widow's climb still there, huh? Meaner than ever." He waited. I waited. I could hear both of us trying not to make this harder than it already was. "You need help with anything?" he asked. The right answer was probably no. The honest answer was yes, with more weight than one boy should carry. "I could use company," I said. "Sometime, if you want." Another pause, then, "Maybe. I got games the next 2 weekends." "Games come first. I get it. Maybe after that. After that works." When we hung up, I sat in the dark a long time with the phone in my hand and the screen gone black. It wasn't much. It was not nothing. The mountain had its own way of narrowing your world to what was directly in front of you. A bootlace that needed tying, a log that needed splitting before rain, a sack of flour that needed to stay dry. I respected that, even liked it. But it also stripped away excuses. There was no traffic to blame for being late, no shop noise to drown out thinking, no crowded schedule to hide behind when someone needed you. If I was lonely up there, I had chosen lonely. If I wanted things different with my son, I had to do more than want. So I made plans in small, manageable pieces. Clear the porch so 2 people could sit without moving paint cans. Find my mother's cast iron skillet and season it right. Fix the back step where one board flexed under weight. Stock actual food, not just coffee and canned chili, in case Eli did come. I wrote lists in a spiral notebook and crossed items off with mechanic satisfaction, dark lines, clean proof of effort. It looked like progress on paper. Some days it even felt like progress in my chest. Most nights, though, I still woke at 2 or 3 with that heavy, waking dread I used to get before opening the shop after a bad quarter. The house would be quiet except for rafters ticking in cold and Juniper turning once on her blanket. I'd lie there and stare at the ceiling, tracking knots in the wood grain by moonlight, and think about how grief and regret could occupy the same room without ever speaking to each other. I missed my mother in practical ways first, the way she could make a meal out of little, the way she never made silence feel like punishment, the way she asked direct questions and waited for real answers. I missed my son in unfinished ways, which was harder. There was still time there, maybe. Time if I did better. Time if I stayed steady long enough for him to trust the steadiness. By the end of that month, I had calluses back on my palms, a repaired fence line, and a path I could climb without cursing every 3rd step. I also had a clearer understanding of what I had come up the mountain to do. I hadn't come to hide, no matter how convincing that story had sounded while I packed boxes in town. I had come because I needed room to hear myself plain, and because the house my mother left me still held a shape of life that was worth rebuilding if I had the nerve to rebuild it. Widow's Climb was still slick, still mean, still waiting to take the best of my balance each morning. I kept walking it anyway, groceries in both hands, Juniper close, learning one careful trip at a time that carrying weight and being crushed by it were not the same thing. One cold evening after a wet climb, I set a sack down halfway to catch my breath, and 2 cans slid out and vanished into Salal. I kept going, planning to hunt them later. At dusk, I stepped onto the porch and stopped. The missing cans sat beside the door, and a neat stack of dry kindling leaned against the rail. The woods had gone strangely quiet. No jays, no thrushes. And Juniper stood at my knee, ears forward, tail low, calm. I stood there long enough for the chill to work through my jacket and settle between my shoulder blades. The 2 cans were the same brand of tomatoes I'd watched roll off my sack 20 minutes earlier, one with a scratch across the label from the rock it had hit. They sat upright, side by side, dry as if they'd come off a pantry shelf. The kindling beside them was split cedar and fir, wrist thick and even, bark turned outward in a tidy stack my mother would have approved of. I had not cut that wood. I had not hauled it. I had not left those cans by the door. Juniper leaned against my leg and looked past me. Not at the wood, not at the cans, but into the trees beyond the yard where dusk was thinning into that flat grey light that makes every trunk look farther away than it is. Her ears stayed forward, her breathing easy. If she'd been alarmed, I'd have known before I set the groceries down. She was old enough to save her fussing for things that mattered. That calm in her made my own nerves feel louder. I crouched and touched the top stick in the pile. Dry. Not just drier than the rain-soaked stuff around the woodshed, dry enough to catch from one match. I picked up one can, then the other, turning them in my hands like maybe I'd find some note taped to the bottom, some sensible clue with a name and a reason. Nothing. Just tin, label glue, and the smell of wet earth from my gloves. All right, I said to nobody in particular. Either I'm getting absent-minded, or somebody on this mountain has too much time. Juniper gave me a patient look, the same one she used when I missed her water dish and talked to the faucet instead. Inside, the cabin held heat from the stove, and that faint mineral smell old houses get when rain has been hitting the roof all day. I set the groceries on the counter and stood there with both hands flat on the wood, listening. No jays in the firs, no nuthatches ticking from the fence line. Even the creek sounded muted, as if the mountain had pulled a blanket over itself. I wanted to call it weather. I wanted to call it my imagination. I wanted one clean explanation I could put in a drawer and shut. Instead, I found myself moving room to room with no real purpose, checking latches, checking windows, touching familiar things. My mother's enamel bread tin was still on top of the fridge, blue edge chipped white at the corner. Her old raincoat still hung by the back door, sleeves bent from a shape that wasn't there anymore. Grief is strange that way. You can carry it for months like a sack of feed, then one odd detail sets it down on your chest all at once. I made soup from a can and ate half of it standing at the sink. The spoon clicked against the bowl. Juniper settled on her blanket near the stove, one eye half open, still tracking me. I tried the television for 10 minutes and turned it off. Static would have been less lonely than whatever game show was on, bright studio lights and people clapping on command. By 9, rain had started again, soft and steady, and I sat on the porch step under the eave with a blanket over my knees, because that's where thinking always found me whether I wanted it or not. I thought about Eli, about how teenagers can smell pressure like dogs smell thunder. Every time I tried too hard on the phone, he pulled back an inch. Every time I kept it simple, he gave me one extra sentence. It was like learning a new tool by feel in the dark. Useful, delicate, easy to strip if you forced it. I kept seeing his face at 12 when he still followed me around the garage, asking what every wrench did. I kept hearing 16-year-old Eli saying, "Maybe after that." And I knew how thin that promise was unless I met it with steadiness, not speeches. I also thought about those cans and that firewood, because there wasn't much else to do with my mind and no one around to talk me down from my own theories. A neighbour could have done it. Folks on the ridge still helped one another in practical ways. But nobody came up Widow's Climb in wet weather for fun, and whoever had carried that wood had done it quiet enough that Juniper never barked. She barked when squirrels judged us from the fence post. She barked when the mail truck backfired half a mile down. She had not made a sound. "I am not getting spooked by free firewood," I said into the rain. That would be a new low. Juniper huffed once, which I took as fair criticism. When I went to bed, I left the porch light on. I told myself it was for easier footing if I had to step out in the night. The truth sat right beside that lie and didn't bother hiding. Sometime after midnight, I woke to silence so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. No wind, no branch tap, no creak chatter. Just the old wall clock in the kitchen, and Juniper lifting her head from the floor. I lay there looking at the ceiling boards and waited for the usual mountain sounds to come back. They did, slowly, like somebody turning knobs one at a time. First a drip from the gutter, then a distant owl, then the creek finding its voice again. I slept after that, shallow and choppy, dreaming of carrying groceries that got lighter the higher I climbed. Morning came raw and clear, with fog pooled down in the drainage and sunlight touching only the upper firs. I walked out with coffee in one hand and looked at the porch. The kindling stack was still there, neat as before, but now there were 4 more split sticks added to the side. Same size, same careful lay. Nobody had knocked. Nobody had left tracks I could make out on the packed ground by the steps. Only Juniper's prints and mine. I set my mug down and rubbed my eyes with both thumbs. "Nope," I said, "not doing this half awake." By the second morning after that first stack appeared, I had decided on a system, because systems were how I kept from drifting. I marked the plastic sack handles with a line of blue grease pencil before each climb. I counted cans at the truck, counted again at the porch, and wrote numbers in the spiral notebook by the phone. I checked my own memory against the page before bed. If I was misplacing things, I wanted proof. If someone was helping, I wanted pattern. That day, Widow's Climb lived up to its name. Clay slick near the lower washout, loose shale on the middle bend, one root polished smooth enough to throw me sideways if I put weight on it wrong. Juniper moved ahead and then waited, moved and waited, old herding habits still in her bones. Halfway up, where the trail narrows between 2 cedars, I stopped to shift a heavy bag from my left hand to my right. I heard one solid footfall uphill behind me, then nothing. I turned, empty path, ferns dripping, fog lifting in slow ribbons. "Morning," I said, because if it was a person, that was polite, and if it was nothing, no harm done. No answer came. Juniper looked past my shoulder, tail level, then sat down right there in the mud like she was waiting for a slow friend to catch up. Not tense, not wary, just patient. I climbed the rest of the way with my scalp prickling under my cap, set the groceries on the counter, and checked the handles. All 3 marked lines were there. Nothing missing. I felt ridiculous for being relieved, and ridiculous for being disappointed at the same time. Evidence would have settled me one way or the other. Normal would have settled me too. Instead, I got this middle ground where facts kept refusing to line up clean. That afternoon, I worked on the back step, replacing the board that flexed. Hammer, drill, level, repeat. Ordinary tasks, measured cuts, sawdust on my sleeves. The mountain gave me birds again, then took them away all at once near sunset. Juniper, who usually barked twice at deer crossing the upper edge of the yard, stood at the porch rail and watched the trees with her ears up and her body loose, as if she recognized a shape I couldn't yet see. I stepped out beside her, wiping my hands on a rag. "You got a friend out there?" She glanced up at me, then back to the timber, and sat. That was her answer. 3 days passed before I admitted, at least on paper, that this wasn't one odd evening. Each day I found some small correction made in my favor. A dropped sack at the lower switchback would appear under the porch eave before dark, cleaner than when I'd lost it. Wet sticks I'd left in a loose pile by the chopping block were restacked with dry pieces threaded between them for airflow, the exact trick my mother taught me. Once, after I left 2 cans and a jar of sauce near a stump so I could double back for flour, all 3 were waiting at the top, upright and unbroken, with a flat stone laid beside them like a paperweight against wind. I tried every practical explanation until they thinned out from use. Helpful neighbour, sure, but which one moved through cedar duff without snapping a twig? Memory lapses, maybe, but memory lapses didn't arrange split wood by length. Gravity, maybe, but gravity had never in its life carried groceries uphill and set them beside my door. That evening I took it slow on purpose. 1 bag in each hand, 1 over my shoulder, same pace I'd use if somebody old or tired was walking behind me, and I didn't want to shame them by rushing. The forest was damp from afternoon mist, smelling of cedar sap, wet clay, and crushed fern. A few late asters leaned over the trail edge, pale purple against rust-red soil. Juniper trotted 10 yards ahead, paused, looked back, and kept going, calm as a metronome. I told myself this couldn't be real, then heard the soft crunch of weight settling on shale somewhere beyond the switchback, and felt the thought lose its grip. Whatever was on that slope moved with care. It paused when I paused. It started when I started. No crowding, no hurry. Just presence, steady and deliberate, as if it understood the same trail rules I did. At the upper bend, where the clay usually stole my footing, I shifted the heaviest sack higher against my shoulder and kept my eyes on the next step. "We're fine," I said to Juniper, though I wasn't talking only to her. Just taking it one at a time. Behind me, a footfall answered, gentle for something that heavy. I kept walking at my normal pace and pretended not to notice. The footfall matched my next step, then stopped when I stopped to test a patch of clay with the edge of my boot. I kept my eyes on the trail and did the slow, careful breathing I used under trucks when a rusted bolt wanted to strip. Juniper stood uphill from me, head turned back, waiting with that level look of hers. I shifted my shoulder under the heavy sack and said, "Easy, girl, we're not racing." I took 3 more steps and felt the weight on my shoulder lighten so gradually, I first blamed my own balance. The path leveled for maybe 6 feet there, and sometimes that fooled your body into thinking the load had changed. I climbed another 10 yards, set both hand sacks down, and reached back to grab the shoulder bag. It wasn't there. I didn't spin around. I didn't call out. I stood in place with my hand hanging in air like I'd forgotten what it was for, then lowered it and picked up the 2 sacks again. My heart had started hammering, not from fear exactly, more from that raw confusion you get when a thing has become unarguable, but your mind still tries to argue anyway. Juniper turned and kept walking, unbothered. I followed her. At the porch, I found the missing sack set upright beside the door, grease pencil mark facing outward like a label in a parts bin. No torn plastic, no crushed bread. The eggs were still in one piece. I set my 2 sacks beside it and looked at all 3 as if one might explain itself if I stared long enough. "You seeing this too?" I asked Juniper. She sat down, scratched once behind her white ear, and then went to sniff the porch rail where rain had dried in faint streaks. Helpful, as always. Inside, I unpacked with notebook precision, checking each item against what I'd loaded at the truck. 2 cans of tomatoes, jar of sauce, coffee, flour, onions, apples, eggs, loaf of sandwich bread, dog food. Nothing missing, nothing dented. The tomatoes were cleaner than when I bought them. I ran a thumb over one label and found no mud, only the smooth paper chill from outside air. Practical mind, practical problem. If there was a person helping me, I needed to thank him and maybe ask why he was staying out of sight. If there wasn't a person, then I had crossed into a kind of confusion that calls for sleep and maybe a doctor. Before dark had fully settled, I set up a little test and hated myself for how serious I got about it. I tied one grocery sack handle with orange baling twine from the shed and knotted the ends in the same way I'd tied radiator hoses for years. Loop and pull, hard to fake by accident. I left that sack empty on the lower porch step. Then I placed 3 split sticks in a crooked row by the woodpile, a shape no tidy-minded neighbor would leave alone. It felt absurd, like I was baiting a ghost with farm chores. I laughed once, a dry little sound, and muttered, "Kane Jordan, master mechanic, now running covert operations against mystery housekeeping." Juniper wagged once at my tone and pressed her shoulder against my leg. That helped more than I wanted to admit. Cold boards under my feet pulled me out of sleep while the window was still black and the smell of wet cedar came through the trim. The empty sack was gone from the step. I found it hanging from a nail by the back door, twine knot untouched. The 3 crooked sticks by the woodpile had become a clean stack, bark sides all facing out. Beside them sat 2 more dry pieces I hadn't cut. As grey light spread through the kitchen, curiosity had edged past grief in a way I hadn't felt since moving up there. It didn't erase anything. My mother was still gone. Eli was still careful with me on the phone. Widow's Climb was still steep and slick and ready to humble me. But for stretches of a day, my mind wasn't circling old mistakes. It was engaged, watching, noticing, wondering. On my next supply run, I carried 1 bag down empty and 1 bag up full, then switched halfway like I was running a drill. Juniper moved ahead, then stopped at the cedar stump just off the upper switchback, a stump I'd passed 100 times without looking close. She sat beside it and waited for me. Someone had left a bundle of wild onions there, roots wrapped in damp moss, so they wouldn't dry out. Next to them lay 2 smooth river stones crossed in an X, deliberate as a marker. On top of the stones rested a spray of late asters tied with grass, purple heads still fresh. I set my bag down and crouched, careful not to touch any of it yet. The onions smelled sharp and clean, that green bite that catches in your nose and makes you think of spring gardens, even with frost edging the shadowed ground. I looked at Juniper. "That from your friend?" She leaned forward, sniffed once, and then sat back with her mouth slightly open, easy and relaxed. No raised hackles, no warning growl, just attention. I stayed there a long while, elbows on knees, studying the little arrangement. The stones came from the creek at the bottom crossing, rounded and pale. Carrying them up this far would have taken effort. The asters grew on the south bank near the old fence line, not here. Whoever put this together knew the slope and knew plants and took time with his hands. A thought came to me quiet and plain. This wasn't random help. It was communication, whatever form of it was available. I took 1 onion and left the rest. I didn't touch the crossed stones or flowers. Thank you, I said to the trees, feeling a little foolish and not stopping myself. The way up from there narrowed through alder and young fir where rain had undercut the outside edge. Twice, I heard weight settle uphill and to my right, not crashing through brush, just one careful placement at a time. When I paused to breathe, that sound paused too. When I resumed, it resumed, always offset from me, always giving distance. Juniper never once looked alarmed. She kept a neutral tail and that steady working dog trot, occasionally glancing back, as if checking whether both of us were still in formation. Those climbs began stacking into a pattern, and with November pressing in, I started planning around daylight. Not because I feared the dark, but because I wanted better chances to observe. I had also started cooking real meals again, wild onion and potatoes in cast iron. Biscuits once, burned on one side and still eaten with pride. I caught myself setting 2 plates out one evening and stood there with one in each hand until memory settled where it belonged. I put one plate back. Grief was still grief. But now, there were moments where it shared space with something else. I called Eli that Sunday while soup simmered and rain tapped the stovepipe. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, buddy, you got a minute?" "Yeah, what's up?" "I'm thinking next Friday, if that still works for you. Supper up here. I'll pick you up in town if the weather turns." He was quiet for 2 beats. "Friday should work. Practice ends at 5. 5's good. I'll be there." "You making real food or your emergency chili?" "Real food. I got ingredients and all." He laughed, short and warmer than before. "All right, I'll risk it." When we hung up, I stood with my hand on the warm stove and let that laugh replay once in my head. Then I looked out the window toward Widow's Climb and felt, for the first time in months, a clean line between effort and hope. Rain turned to sleety mist by noon, and the path took on that red sheen that meant trouble. I loaded lighter than usual, 2 sacks only, and still took small steps. Halfway up, where ferns overhung the bank at shoulder height, I noticed several frond tops bent cleanly forward in a line 6 feet off the ground, as if a broad body had moved through without snapping them. Not trampled, not torn, simply pressed and released. I reached up with one hand and couldn't touch the highest bend point without stretching. My breath fogged in front of me. "All right," I said softly. "You're tall." The answer came as a soft shift of shale uphill, then stillness. I kept climbing. The trail crossed a seep where water ran thin over clay, and there I finally saw a print clear enough to freeze me in place. It wasn't full, more a partial edge where weight had pressed into mud and then lifted, but the curve and width were beyond any boot I'd seen. Beside it sat my own tread mark from that morning, size 11 work boot, suddenly looking like a child's comparison sketch. I knelt and laid my glove near the impression. My whole hand covered less than half the visible width. I stayed kneeling longer than comfort allowed, mind moving through explanation after explanation and setting each one down. Hoax made no sense on this slope, in this weather, with this consistency. Bear made no sense for shape and placement and every other sign. Human prank made no sense for gait, reach, and the neat competence that kept saving my groceries from my own clumsiness. What remained was not tidy, and I had spent my life preferring tidy. I rose, adjusted my grip, and walked on because groceries still had to get home whether the world stayed understandable or not. Near the upper shale pinch, where the trail opened for 15 yards before ducking under cedar limbs, Juniper stopped dead, not from fear, but from a tension so complete it felt like ceremony. She stood with ears forward and tail level, then stepped to the side of the path and sat. She looked uphill. I looked where she looked. At first I saw only trunks and mist. Then a dark vertical shape moved behind a fir, crossed a gap, and became briefly, unmistakably whole. He was enormous, 8 feet at least, maybe more on that slope, shoulders broad as a doorway, covered in dark fur mottled with rain. And he moved with a care I had never seen in anything that size. He stepped over loose shale instead of through it, placing each foot on stable stone like a man protecting a bad knee. One long arm extended to brush a branch aside so it wouldn't snap back across the trail. He was angled away from me, giving me profile and distance, not crowding, not closing in, simply occupying space with an old, quiet competence that made the mountain seem built to his measure. Every muscle in me went tight, then slowly eased, because nothing in him read as threat. No rush, no display, no posture that said challenge. He paused and turned his head just enough that I caught one eye in the filtered light, amber brown and steady. The look landed on me and held without pressure. I had the strange, grounding sense that he was evaluating my footing, not my weakness. I wanted to run and didn't. I wanted to speak and found I already was. "Juniper," I said, voice rough. "We're just walking home." She gave a little chuff through her nose and stayed seated, content as if we were waiting for a slow tractor on a country lane. I told myself this couldn't be real. And at the same time, another thought rose clearer, one I couldn't shake loose. Whatever this is, it is being careful with me. The sentence repeated in my head with each breath, steadying me. I shifted the heavier bag to my right hand and took one step forward, then another, making my movement plain and unhurried. He mirrored that courtesy by stepping farther uphill, widening the gap. For maybe 40 yards we moved like that, 3 beings on one muddy ribbon of trail, each pretending not to notice how much we were noticing. I kept my gaze mostly down for footing, then up in quick checks. Each time I looked, he was there in partial view through timber, matching pace without overtaking, carrying nothing that I could see, simply present. Once, at a slick route crossing, I felt the bag in my left hand tug upward as if lifted from beneath. I didn't look. I let it lighten, climbed the worst of the rise, and when I reached level ground, the weight returned, settled and balanced. At the porch, I set my sacks down and counted breaths, then turned half sideways, giving the yard and tree line a respectful angle instead of a stare. Juniper walked to the edge of the steps and sat facing the cedars, tail thumping once against wet wood. In the last grey light, he stood between 2 trunks maybe 30 yards out, still as a fence post, then inclined his head almost imperceptibly and stepped back into cover, leaving only rain motion and dark bark behind. I carried the groceries inside with hands that trembled and set them on the counter one by one like fragile tools. When I unbagged them, nothing was bruised. The tomatoes were intact. The bread wasn't crushed. On top of the last sack lay 3 late asters tied with grass. I stood at the counter with those 3 asters in my hand, grass tied damp against my fingers, and for a long minute I did not move. The kitchen light hummed. The stove clicked as it cooled. Juniper drank from her bowl and then came over and leaned into my leg hard enough to remind me where I was. I set the flowers in a mason jar and filled it from the tap. Purple petals opened a little in the warm room, and the sight of them on my mother's old windowsill made my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected. Whoever had been beside me on that trail had chosen those from the same South Bank patch I used to pick for her when I was a kid and wanted to get out of raking. Not a random handful, not grabbed and crushed. Chosen. I carried the jar to the table, sat down, and pressed my palms flat against the wood until the shaking in them eased. I told myself this couldn't be real, then looked at the grass knot, then at the clean groceries lined in a row, and that sentence started sounding like habit more than truth. A mechanic's mind likes causes you can point to. You hear a whine under load, you check bearings. You smell fuel, you check lines. Simple chain, simple fix. What I had now was a pattern of care with no name attached and no demand following it. The mountain outside held steady silence. Not empty silence, but occupied, attentive, as if it was giving me room to catch up. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch with my coat unbuttoned against the cold. "Thank you," I said toward the cedar line, voice low so I wouldn't spook myself with it. "I don't know what else to call this, but thank you." No movement answered right away. Then, from farther upslope than I could see through the trunks, came one soft knock of wood on wood, like a branch set down instead of dropped. Juniper's ears tipped forward. Her tail gave one deliberate sweep against the porch boards. She stayed loose, easy, content. That mattered more than any theory I could build. I slept badly and honestly. No pretending. I woke twice, listened, and each time heard ordinary mountain life layered with something else. A heavy placement in wet duff, then stillness, then a second step drifting away from the house, never toward it. By dawn, my skepticism was still alive, but it had changed shape. It was no longer arguing that nothing had happened. It was asking what kind of being moved like that and chose gentleness each chance it got. By Thursday morning, low cloud had settled into the drainage, and Widow's Climb shone red and slick where runoff crossed it. I needed one more full supply run for Friday dinner with Eli, and I loaded the truck in town like a man preparing for inspection. Chicken thighs, onions, potatoes, carrots, flour, butter, canned tomatoes, apples, a loaf that wasn't already stale, and one peach pie from the grocery bakery that looked too glossy to be homemade, but still smelled right. I added Eli's favourite root beer in glass bottles because he always rolled his eyes at canned soda, and then drank two anyway. On the tailgate, I marked every sack handle with grease pencil and tied one with orange twine again, not to challenge anything now, but to anchor myself. The first 100 yards up the path went the way hard climbs always go. Breath finding rhythm, shoulders settling under weight, boots testing each patch before trust. Juniper moved ahead in her old working pattern. 10 yards out, pause, glance back, continue. At the lower switchback, the birds cut off at once. Not panic, just a clean quiet, as if someone had closed a door on sound. I felt that familiar prickling along my neck and said, "Morning," into the trees without turning around. A footfall came from uphill right, measured and heavy. Then another. I smiled despite myself, mostly out of nerves. "We're loaded down today," I said to Juniper, louder than needed. "Company for supper tomorrow. Can't show up with a busted pie." The next stretch was narrow and muddy, and I focused on placement. After a dozen steps, the right-hand sack in my grip went lighter. Not jerked, lifted just enough to take the strain off my fingers. I kept walking. "Appreciate it," I said, and heard my own voice steady for the first time in days. Juniper didn't even look back. She just kept that neutral tail and trotted on. Like this arrangement was practical and overdue. At the cedar stump, I stopped on purpose and set my remaining bag down. The crossed river stones were still there, washed clean by mist, and someone had added a third stone upright at the top, balanced careful as a level bubble. Beside it lay 2 fir cones and another little bundle of wild onions, smaller this time, tied with grass. I laughed under my breath, warm and self-conscious. "All right," I said. "You're better at this than I am." When I straightened, he was standing 35 yards uphill between 2 alders, in full daylight softened by cloud. There was no dramatic reveal left in it, no jolt of terror, only scale and stillness and that same deliberate patience. Broad chest, dark wet fur, long arms hanging easy, hands open, one holding the sack by its handles with a precision that looked almost delicate against how large he was. He watched me the way a good stockman watches a skittish horse, not pressing, not retreating too fast either, just holding steady until trust can catch up. I lifted one hand, palm out, then let it drop because anything more felt theatrical. "That's mine," I said, nodding at the sack. "I mean, yes, obviously you know that." Juniper sat down at my boot, panting softly, and gave him a quick look that read like acknowledgement between co-workers. He lowered the sack to a flat patch of ground halfway between us and stepped back 2 long paces. Then he waited. I walked forward slowly, picked up the bag, and checked the handles. No stretch marks, no crushed corners. I looked up again and found his eyes on me, amber brown in that grey light, calm and unreadable except for one thing: no fear. He wasn't hiding from me anymore, and he wasn't pushing closer. He was meeting me at the exact edge I could handle, like he had judged that edge better than I had myself. "Okay," I said, and the word carried a lot. "Okay, we can do it this way." He inclined his head once, almost too small to see, then moved uphill through the alders with astonishing quiet for his size. Branches bent and slid back with no snap. Ferns pressed and rose. The mountains seemed to receive his weight rather than fight it. I stood there grinning like an idiot until Juniper nudged my calf as if to remind me groceries were not going to walk themselves home. By late afternoon, the sky had dropped lower, turning from grey to that hard pewter colour that means sleet is already on the way. I should have waited until morning for the last trip, but Friday dinner was set, and I had promised Eli hot food and no excuses. I packed the final load at the truck: cast iron skillet wrapped in towel, potatoes, carrots, the pie, root beer bottles clinking in a sack, and my mother's enamel bread tin because I wanted homemade biscuits on the table, like she used to do when Eli was little and still ate 3 at a sitting. Carrying that tin up Widow's Climb felt like carrying a piece of both of them at once. Halfway to the first switchback, the sleet started, fine pellets ticking off jacket fabric and leaves. Red clay went glossy in minutes. Juniper stayed close now, no scouting, just matching my pace at my left knee. "Easy," I told her, and maybe myself. Short steps. At the upper bend, where runoff cut a groove deep enough to trap a boot, my right foot slid out and my knee hit hard. The sack swung wide. One ripped open against a rock and sent potatoes, onions, and bottles rolling downslope. The bread tin popped loose, clanged once, and spun towards the bank. I grabbed at air, caught nothing, and sat there in wet clay, breathing like I'd been punched. "Great," I said hoarsely. "Perfect timing." Juniper bounded downhill after the bottles, not frantic, just intent, and stood over one root beer that had lodged against a root. I pushed up to one knee and felt the hill trying to take me again. Then the sound came. 2 heavy steps from above, quick but controlled, and he entered the trail in front of me without hesitation. Up close, even kneeling, I had to tilt my head back to take him in. Rain-dark fur lay in long ridges over muscle and bone built for this terrain. His hands were enormous and careful at the same time, fingers long enough to wrap a bottleneck and still leave room. He looked at me once, direct and steady, then moved to the scattered groceries like this was a job that needed doing, and no ceremony required. He picked up each glass bottle separately and set it upright in the intact sack, cushioning them with the dish towel from my skillet bundle. He gathered potatoes from the clay and rubbed them clean against wet fern before placing them in. He found onions wedged in salal, the pie box tipped on its side, the carrots half hidden under leaves. Nothing got thrown. Nothing got crushed. Juniper followed 2 steps behind, tail level, occasionally nosing an item toward his reach, like she had been assigned assistant duties, and accepted them. I stayed where I was because standing too fast would have put me on my back again. My hands were muddy, my jeans soaked at the knee, and I felt absurdly close to tears over a bag of groceries. He reached the bread tin last. It had landed upside down in the ditch, with sleet collecting in the lid. He lifted it with both hands, turned it upright, shook the water out in one smooth motion, and wiped the enamel edge with the clean corner of that same towel before setting it gently beside me on stable ground. That did it. Not the size of him, not the path. The care for that old chipped tin undid something I had bolted shut. I covered my mouth with my muddy hand and cried there on Widow's Climb like a man who had spent too long pretending he was only tired. I cried for my mother, for Eli, for every call I cut short because I didn't know what to say, for every meal eaten standing up because sitting down felt too honest. Juniper came and leaned her shoulder into my chest, warm and solid, while sleet tapped the leaves around us. "I'm trying," I said, not sure who I was speaking to. "I am trying to get this right." He stood a few feet away holding the repaired sack by its handles, waiting until my breathing evened. When I nodded, he stepped forward and set the bag within easy reach of my right hand, then placed the second sack beside it, with the bottles balanced at the top where they wouldn't clink hard. He looked at Juniper, then back at me, and gave one long, calm regard that carried no demand and no pity, only recognition. I pushed to my feet slowly. He stayed still until I had my balance. "Thank you," I said, voice wrecked but clear, "for all of it." He turned upslope and moved ahead 3 paces, then paused and glanced back, not as an order, more like an invitation to follow the safer line he had chosen along fir roots and embedded stone. I took it. We climbed the last stretch that way, Juniper between us, sleet thinning to cold rain. At the porch, he set the heavier sack down under the eave, angled so water ran off, and with one careful finger nudged my mother's bread tin farther from the edge where it might slide. I faced the door, hands shaking, and said to Juniper in my best normal voice, "Well, girl, looks like supper survived." Her tail thumped the boards twice. When I turned back, he was already at the tree line. He stopped once, half in shadow, gave that same steady look, and slipped into the cedars without sound. I carried the groceries inside one bag at a time, set the bread tin in the middle of the counter, and stood there with rainwater dripping from my cuffs, feeling the house around me as company instead of emptiness, for the first time since I came home. I set my palms on the counter and bowed my head over that bread tin, water from my sleeves ticking onto enamel, and the second wave came harder than on the trail, because there was no mud under me now, no need to keep balance, no practical task to hide inside. My chest hitched so sharply it hurt. I slid down until I was sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, knees up, Juniper pressing into my hip like she was trying to keep me from drifting off somewhere I shouldn't go. I cried until my face felt raw and the room blurred at the edges, and while I did, I kept seeing small things I hadn't let myself touch. My mother's hands dusted with flour, Eli at 9 standing on a chair to cut biscuit dough with a jelly jar, me saying I'd be at one more weekend shift and then another and another. Grief and regret had been standing shoulder to shoulder in me for months, each one waiting for the other to speak first. On that floor, they finally did. I don't mean it got pretty. It was messy and loud in a quiet house. I wiped my nose on my sleeve like a kid. I laughed once through the crying because I caught myself apologizing to the dog for being dramatic, and she looked at me with that same steady patience she gave me when I talked to potatoes in the mud. When the surge eased, I stayed there, breathing and staring at the stove door glow, and my mind shifted into that strange, clear state that comes after hard crying, when denial has worn itself out. I was standing in that kitchen. My jeans were soaked through. My hands smelled like wet cedar and onion skins. A being I could not categorize had just carried my supper up a mountain and treated my mother's bread tin with more tenderness than I'd shown my own life lately. I was done pretending numbness was strength. I was done calling isolation practical. The thought came plain and without drama, and because it came that way, I trusted it. By the time the kitchen clock reached 7, I had changed into dry clothes, hung my wet jacket by the stove, and lined every recovered item across the counter like evidence and gratitude at once. Root beer bottles unbroken, pie box corners intact, potatoes rinsed and drying on a towel. I set the bread tin in the center and ran my thumb over the chipped blue rim where he had wiped away sleet. Then I opened it and found the old biscuit cutter still inside, exactly where my mother left it. That made me smile through swollen eyes. I washed my face at the sink, looked out toward the cedars, and said quietly, "I got it from here." Juniper lifted her head from the rug, listened, then rested it again between her paws, as if she agreed that the words were not performative. They were report. I still had one thing to do before the night got old. I dried my hands, picked up my phone, and called Eli. He answered on the third ring with wind noise in the background and boys shouting somewhere behind him. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, buddy, you done with practice?" "Just now. Coach ran us long. You okay? You sound, I don't know, like you ran a mile." I leaned on the sink and watched fog thicken at the tree line. Had a slick climb. Took a spill. Groceries tried to make a break for town. He laughed, bright and immediate. "Widow's climb still undefeated." "Not tomorrow. Tomorrow we win on points. 5 o'clock pickup still good?" "Yeah. Mom said that's fine." "You sure you're all right?" I looked at the bread tin, then at Juniper's white ear catching stove light. "Yeah, better than all right, actually. Just tired in a good way." "Okay, I'll be ready." After we hung up, I stood there with the phone in my hand, not squeezing it this time, and felt something settle in me that had been rattling for a long while. I carried 2 mugs out to the porch, though only one had coffee in it, set them side by side on the rail, and sat on the top step under the eave, where rain stitched silver lines through the dark. The mountain smelled alive and clean after sleet, iron-rich clay and fir pitch and cold stone. No bird chatter at first, then a distant owl, then a soft cascade of water where runoff found the gully. Juniper sat with her shoulder touching my shin and looked into the timber with relaxed attention, no stiffness anywhere in her body. I waited without deciding to wait. Minutes passed. Then, just inside the cedar edge, a shape separated from shadow long enough for me to recognize the breadth of him. He stood turned partly away, profile to me, making himself smaller by angle if not by size. One long arm lifted and set a narrow branch against a trunk with a deliberate motion, almost like returning a borrowed tool to its place. He did not step toward the porch. He did not ask for anything. He simply stayed in view long enough that I could understand this was not vanishing in fear. It was departure with courtesy. "Thank you," I said again, not loud, "for tonight, for all week." He held still through one breath, 2, then inclined his head once. After that, he moved upslope through rain-dark ferns with the same measured care he used on the trail, choosing stable ground, avoiding noise where he could, never hurrying like he had something to escape. The last part I saw was one broad shoulder passing behind a cedar trunk and then nothing but wet bark and drifting mist. The woods did not snap shut after him. They reopened slowly, naturally. A jay called once from lower down. Somewhere near the creek, a thrush started up, as if a shift had ended and another had begun. Juniper watched until the sounds evened out, then sighed and put her head on my boot. The quiet after he left was full, not empty. I sat there long enough for my coffee to go cool, then took the second untouched mug back inside with a small grin at myself. Still working on the hosting details, I muttered. I checked the doors and windows out of habit, but the motion had changed meaning. It was no longer barricade, only bedtime routine. In the kitchen, I mixed biscuit dough with stiff fingers and a steadier mind, cut rounds with the old tin cutter, and set them on a tray for morning so I wouldn't rush before pickup. While I worked, I talked under my breath the way folks do when alone too long. Except now, it felt less like holding off silence, and more like sharing a room with memory that had stopped hurting, quite so sharp. I told my mother. I found her cutter. I told her Eli was coming. I told her the mountain had sent help in a form she would have accepted without half the fuss I made over it. Sleep came in pieces, but each piece was deeper than the last. Once, sometime after midnight, I woke to Juniper's ears pricked toward the back of the house. I listened and heard 3 soft, spaced sounds from outside near the woodpile. Stone touching stone, then stillness. No pacing, no scratching at the door, no pressure to come out. I stayed in bed and let the moment be what it was. At first light, I stepped onto the porch in wool socks and found 6 flat rocks set into the worst muddy patch by the top step, each one seated firm and level, angled so runoff would split around them instead of carving deeper. Beside the stones sat the 2 crossed river rocks from the cedar stump, clean and centered where the morning sun would hit them first. No tracks I could clearly read in the churned ground, only impressions softened by night rain. I crouched and touched one newly placed stone. It was cold and solid, sunk with an eye for drainage any good hand would respect. I carried the crossed stones inside, dried them, and set them on the porch rail where I could see them from the table. Then I took my shovel and mattock and went to work on Widow's Climb while breakfast cooked, cutting narrow runoff channels where water wanted to gather, packing gravel into the edges, and fitting those 6 stones into a proper first run of steps so they wouldn't rock loose. Juniper supervised from a dry spot and occasionally wandered to the cedar line, sat for a minute, and came back without urgency. I talked to her while I worked. "We're finishing what he started," I said. "That's the deal." The sentence felt right in my mouth. Not debt, partnership of a quiet kind. By late morning, the rain had eased to mist, and the path near the porch held firm under my weight for the first time all week. I cleaned up, loaded the now lighter grocery sacks for the final carry from truck to cabin, and paused at the top of the steps before heading down. The woods were ordinary again in the best sense. Squirrels bickering, jays rude as ever, wind combing through fir tips, no oversized silhouette in sight, no staged sign asking to be decoded, just mountain life moving forward. I looked toward the cedar stump anyway and gave a small nod. "I'll keep walking normal," I said. "You keep your distance if that's what you want." Juniper sneezed, shook out her coat, and started down Widow's Climb at a working trot. I followed her with empty hands and a full chest, the kind of quiet in me now that comes when something sacred leaves without ceremony and still somehow stays. At the truck, I loaded the last run slower than usual, partly because the clay was still slick, partly because my hands kept resting on ordinary things, as if ordinary had turned rare. Flour, carrots, a sack of apples with one bruised at the top. I marked the handles again out of habit, then paused with the grease pencil in my hand and laughed at myself. "You can retire, old friend. I said, clipping it back in my pocket. Juniper waited by the tailgate, watching the trail, relaxed and ready. The climb up was hard and uneventful in the best way. Birds argued in the firs. Wind moved through alder leaves like dry paper. At the cedar stump, the upright third stone was still balanced over the crossed pear that used to sit there, and the little onion bundle had wilted soft with the weather. I took the onions this time, wrapped them in my bandana, and left one apple on the flat of the stump, red against grey wood. I didn't make a ceremony of it, just set it down and kept walking. By late afternoon, the sky had cleared enough to show a thin stripe of pale blue over the ridge, and I drove down to town for Eli. His duffel bag thumped into the back seat, and he climbed in, wearing his team hoodie, taller again somehow, all elbows and quiet energy. "You look like you lost a fight with a mud pit," he said, eyeing the scrape on my knee. "Mud pit won," I said. "I got a rematch scheduled." He grinned and buckled in. "Smells like biscuits in here." "That would be because your old man finally planned ahead." The drive up gave us 25 minutes of road, then another 20 of climbing with bags between us. Eli took the heavier sack without being asked, and when we hit the first steep rise, he said, "I forgot how mean this path is." "Path's improving," I said, slowly. He looked at the new stones by the top step when we reached the porch and stopped. "You do all that this morning?" "Some of it." He gave me a sidelong look, curious but not pushing, then went inside like a boy who had learned that questions can wait if supper is on the line. I put him to work peeling potatoes while I browned chicken in my mother's cast-iron skillet. Juniper parked herself between us like quality control. The kitchen warmed up with steam and onion and butter, and for a while we talked in the easy fragments I remembered from before things got strained. "Coach still running suicides till people cry?" I asked. "Only on days ending in Y." "Character building." "Cruel and unusual, mostly." I snorted. "You should have worked in my shop one July when the lift motor died." He shook his head. "No thanks." "Oh, I enjoy hearing." When biscuits came out, he took one, split it open, and stared at the bread tin on the counter. "Grandma's?" "Yeah." He touched the chipped rim with one finger and went quiet a second. "I haven't seen this since, you know." "I know." We ate at the table instead of standing at the sink, rain ticking lightly on the roof and stove heat pushing at our backs. He had thirds of potatoes and 2 root beers. The pie turned out better than it had any right to. Somewhere in the middle of it, between him telling me about a chemistry quiz and me pretending to understand infield rotation strategy, we slipped into the first real talk we'd had in a long time. He set his fork down and looked at his hands. "I thought you moved up here to get away from everybody." The sentence landed clean, no accusation in his voice, just a hard truth from a kid who deserved better than guessing. I wiped my mouth and answered him plain. "I moved up here because I was worn down, and I didn't know how to be useful without work swallowing me whole," I said. I told myself it was temporary. Then temporary started looking like hiding. "You were right to be mad." He kept looking down. "I wasn't mad all the time. Mostly I didn't know if I was supposed to wait for you to call or just stop expecting it." I felt that one in my ribs. "You shouldn't have had to wait," I said. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, still not looking up, then finally met my eyes. "You seem different tonight." "I am," I said, and meant it without drama. After dishes, we took 2 mugs of hot cocoa to the porch and sat under blankets while Juniper stretched across both our boots like she owned us. The crossed river stones sat on the rail between us, damp from evening mist and pale in porch light. Eli tapped one with his thumb. "What's the deal with these?" he asked. I watched the cedar line before answering. "You're going to think I've lost it." He huffed a laugh. "Dad, you apologized to potatoes when I was 10 and made me do it too. because you said food deserved respect. That is still good policy. He waited. So I told him. Not like a campfire story, not trying to sell him anything. I told him about the missing cans returning dry, the kindling stacked better than mine, the marked sack handles reappearing uphill, the onions and asters at the stump, the bent ferns too high for me to reach, the partial print in clay that rain later softened flat. I told him about hearing heavy steps that paused when I paused, and about the sleet night when the groceries scattered and a huge, dark figure gathered every item like it mattered. I told him how that hand set the bread tin upright and how I broke open right there on Widow's Climb. Eli listened without interrupting, elbows on knees, cocoa forgotten in his hand. When I finished, he exhaled slowly and stared into the trees. I don't know what to do with that, he said. Me neither, I said. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I just wasn't going to lie to you. He looked at Juniper. She never freaked out. Not once. That dog hates delivery drivers. Exactly. He sat back, considering. Could have been a person messing with you. Could have, I said. I spent weeks trying that explanation on. It tore at every seam. He nodded. Okay. Another pause. I believe that you believe it. It wasn't full agreement, but it wasn't dismissal either. For us, that was progress built on honest ground. I put my mug down and bumped his shoulder with mine. That's enough for tonight. He gave me a small smile. Path still needs work? Always. Then I can come up Saturday mornings, at least till baseball starts. The offer was simple. It felt enormous. 3 days later, by the second week of November, he did come up on a cold, bright Saturday with gloves too thin for mountain work and more effort than technique. We cut runoff channels together where the clay kept washing out, and I showed him how to seat stones so weight drove down instead of rolling sideways. Around noon he stood up, stretched his back, and pointed downslope. Dad? 2 flat rocks now sat beside the section we'd just started. Same kind of creek stone as the first 6, wet and clean, and exactly the size we needed to bridge a gap. We hadn't carried them up. No one was on the trail below us. Juniper trotted to the stones, sniffed once, then sat and looked toward the cedars with her tail making one slow, steady sweep. Eli stared for a long moment, then said quietly, "Okay, that is weird." "Yeah," I said softly. "It is." We set those stones in place without another word. He worked carefully after that, glancing toward the tree line now and then, not scared, just aware. At lunch, he ate onion biscuits on the porch and asked if the flowers had looked like these dried ones I kept in the spiral notebook. I showed him the grass tie I had saved between wax paper, and he touched it like it might crumble. No grand reveal ever came after that, and none was needed. We had other Saturdays, frost, then rain, then one windy day that peeled the sky clean all the way to the far ridge. Sometimes we'd find one new rock at the Bad Bend by morning. Sometimes a stack of split kindling waited under the eave before dawn. Once, after a hard storm, I found the drainage notch above the upper switchback cleared of leaves I hadn't touched. I stopped trying to catch him at it. The pattern was the message. By the first spring storm, Widow's Climb held. Water ran where we had taught it to run. The stone steps stayed true under load. I carried 2 full grocery sacks up in sleet and did not slip once. At the porch, I set them down, looked at the rail where the crossed stones still sat, and felt gratitude settle in me, like a tool finally back in the right drawer. I never filed a report. I never sent a photo to a hotline. The one picture I did take of that partial print had blurred in rain and became mud by morning anyway, so I deleted it and kept the drawing I made in my notebook beside a boot outline and date. The grease pencil marks faded off old sack handles, and those bags got reused until they tore. The orange twine is still looped on a nail by the back door. The asters dried and flattened but held their shape. The bread tin sits centered on my counter, used every week. As for people, the only one I told all the way through was Eli. His mom gave me one long look at pickup one evening when he mentioned mystery rock deliveries. Then she shook her head and said, "Whatever gets him outdoors with you, keep doing it." She never asked for details, and I never pushed them on her. The men at the parts store still call Widow's Climb by its old name and complain about mud. One older neighbor, Mr. Tally, saw the crossed stones on my porch rail when he dropped off fence staples, touched 2 fingers to his cap, and said, "Your mama used to leave apples on stumps." Then he changed the subject to chainsaw oil, and never came back to it. The mountain is still hard. That part didn't change. Clay still turns slick. Groceries still feel heavy on bad knee days. Grief still catches me sometimes at the sink, when evening light hits the windowsill just right. But I don't live like I'm alone in an empty place anymore. I live like I'm in a larger neighborhood than I understood, one with room for wordless help and careful distance and kindness bigger than logic. Some mornings heading up the final rise with juniper and a sack cutting into my fingers, I still say out loud, "We're fine, just taking it one at a time." It started as nerves. Now it's a promise. I carry my groceries, I carry my part with my son. I carry my mother's memory without folding under it. And somewhere in those cedars, whether near or far, I carry the certainty that something vast once chose to be gentle with me, and that made all the difference.